Stratagem, Chapter 3. When I awoke, I was tied tightly to a chair with rope around my waist and my ankles. My wrists burned from the silver handcuffs that remained on them. The boys also remembered to tighten the handcuffs once the silver forced me to shift back to my own form. I kept my eyes closed and my head limp, pretending to be asleep. In my mind, I quickly went over the information that I had gathered about my captors. The boy that was in the trunk with me was named Brody. I also collected the names of the blonde, Aaron, and the driver, Dan. This shift had been a bad idea, but if they hadn't known, I could have caught them off guard. Aaron seemed like the leader. He was the one who had told Dan about my ability to shift. They also knew that I couldn't shift when in contact with Silver. I remembered Aaron saying something about his dad not lying. I wondered what he meant by that. So his father knew about mimics? Maybe his father knew about the agency. But what did these boys want with me? Did they know about my mission? So what is she? What do we call her? Dan asked. Well, there are many names: Skinwalker, Mimic, all Native American lore. Is this real? Does that mean werewolves and vampires are real too? I heard a sigh. Dude, Aaron, I didn't believe until I saw it with my own eyes. I squinted my eye open so I could see them. None of them were looking my way. Like I said, my dad wouldn't lie. Neither would Smith. Well, at least not about this, Aaron said. I could see his eyebrows were creased. I wonder how many like her are out there. He had no wonder in his voice. It was angry, accusatory. Then Brody spoke. I wonder how many out there are being used like her. I opened my eyes to see his brows drawn together in a frown. His words took me by surprise. Brody, you have to stop thinking of her as a victim. Aaron was shaking his head at Brody. She's not a victim. She chose this, and she's a monster. I clenched my jaw, fighting back anger. His words proved that he didn't know much about me. Aaron, you have to stop thinking of her as the bad guy. There are bigger fish to fry here. You don't know what her story is. You don't know what they're holding against her. Guys, Dan interrupted. I think she's awake. Suddenly all three boys stared at me. Dan stepped forward. Welcome, he said, smiling. Aaron shoved Dan away. I scanned the room. There was a gas lamp and a fire in the fireplace, probably no electricity. The room had high ceilings with exposed beams. There was a kitchen with the bare minimum furnishings and a small round kitchen table with 3 chairs tucked underneath. I was currently tied to the 4th chair. There was also a living room area, and situated around the fireplace were 2 ratty love seats and an overstuffed recliner with a floral pattern on it. The windows were covered in plastic, probably to keep what little warmth there was inside. My teeth began chattering. My sweater hung down off one shoulder after being stretched out when I shifted into Brody's form. And my leggings were hardly enough to keep me warm on a cold fall day. My hair hung limply around my face, and I tried to toss it back. As Aaron whispered something to Dan, Brody approached and bent down to look me in the eyes. Are you okay? Do you need something to drink? To eat? I tried to clench my jaw, be strong, but I couldn't stop the chattering of my teeth. Brody watched me until Aaron pulled him back by the elbow. What are you doing? Aaron whispered fiercely, but it wasn't quiet enough for me not to hear. I'm making sure she's comfortable, Brody answered matter-of-factly. That's not our job. Aaron motioned between the both of them. Dan watched the back and forth. The boys seemed to forget about me, so I repositioned myself in the chair. Aaron, she's a person. I'm not going to let her sit here starving and freezing. Not until she tells us something. Aaron turned to me. His eyes were cold, and his mouth was set in a line. He straightened up and then asked a question I wasn't expecting. What did you want with Mr. Gray? I turned away, not wanting to give anything away. These boys did their homework. Even at the agency, my mission was a secret. But these boys knew my mission had to do with Mr. Gray. Well, I was sitting outside his house. I ignored his question and studied the flames in the fireplace. They must have learned about the mission from Aaron's father, the same person who told them about mimics. But what would make them want to come and kidnap me? Revenge? Ransom? What were their plans for me? If it was some kind of revenge, then they could have killed me right away. They wanted answers for some reason. But I knew that if I gave them answers, I would be dead, either by their hands or by the agency. Aaron leaned close so I couldn't ignore him. I said, "What did you want with Mr. Gray?" I clenched my jaw again, trying to make my teeth stop chattering, trying to look braver than I was feeling, but my body started shivering instead. I was sure they could sense my fear. Aaron turned to Dan and Brody. He punctuated his words with anger. "We're not giving her anything until she starts to talk." He grabbed the axe that rested by the door. My breath caught and I froze, bringing my shoulders up. I wasn't able to do anything but to protect myself. Though the boys didn't seem violent, I knew that I couldn't underestimate what they were capable of, especially Aaron, who seemed to hold a particular hatred towards me. Aaron noticed that I was watching. "Oh, don't worry about this." He let out a humorless laugh. "This is for firewood. I have something else in mind for you." With that, he turned towards the door, taking the axe with him, his shoes heavily thumping across the wood floor. As he left, he slammed the door behind him. Dan acknowledged Brody, concern in his eyes. Brody went into the room that was off the living area. He came back with a fleece blanket. Dan started, "But Aaron said..." Brody walked by Dan and tucked the blanket around my shoulders and legs. I felt the heavy warmth of his hands through the blanket. I tried to sink back in my seat to get away, but his hands didn't linger a moment longer than necessary. He turned back to Dan. "Watch her. I need to go talk to him." And with that, Brody was out the door, and I was left alone with Dan. He plopped down on the kitchen table, his feet dangling inches from the floor. I watched him as he watched me. Dan had blue eyes and a t-shirt that said Gearhead Garage, and he had to be about 6'3". He flicked his hair out of his eyes. He began to swing his feet, and I could see that he was the type of person who got bored easily, and that probably got him into a lot of trouble. When Aaron walked out the door, I'd gotten a glimpse outside. The cabin wasn't as remote as I expected, because through the trees I could see another home. We wouldn't have been too far out of the city. Besides, we weren't in the vehicle that long. I felt queasy, remembering the last time I was in the woods with my father. I was ashamed. I pushed that thought out of my mind. Finally, Dan broke the silence. "I hate the smell of this place." When I didn't respond, he continued. "See, that's the thing about Brody. He has this sense of right like no other. The dude reminds me of Clark Kent. He's a good balance for my cousin who loses his temper easily." I knew then that Dan was their weak spot. He wasn't as focused as the other two. It made sense that he was cousins with Aaron, seeing as they resembled each other. He seemed like a good-time guy, not a businessman. Not as angry as Aaron. My mind flicked through tactics to use on him. At the agency, I studied for situations in which I had to think on my feet, read body language, and react. I was trained in observation, but it wasn't my actual strength. My strength was shifting and doing what I was told. "Dan," I said quietly, "you have to let me go." I tried to muster tears. Acting wasn't my strength either, but I thought I sounded convincing. Dan jumped off the table, surprised I spoke to him, and even more surprised that I called him by his name. "We can't." He moved closer, studying me. He clenched his fists open and closed. He was nervous, but trying not to show it. "Why were you after Mr. Gray?" "I can't tell you, Dan. People are in danger. You have to let me go. Please." My eyes welled with tears as Dan moved closer, his eyebrows raised in sympathy and his mouth twisted with concern. "Don't do that." Dan put one hand up to his forehead. "Don't cry. You're safe for right now." I squinted my eyes, causing the tears to spill over the edges. "You're fine," Dan repeated. I let out a gentle sob. my body rocking. I found that real tears were hidden behind the fake tears, and soon I really was crying. I was scared. I'd never been cut out for this business. I was a normal girl who grew up in a normal house, besides the fact that I was a mimic, which I didn't even learn until I was 10. I was just a teenager. I consciously tried to push away my self-pity. It would do me no good in this situation. My real fear was not these guys. These guys seemed normal, whatever their motives were. Though Aaron was intense, I was afraid that he would snap. There was some raw emotion, something about me that gnawed at him until he couldn't stop from swatting at it. What I was really worried about was the agency and what they would do to me when they got me back, or worse yet, what they would do to me as a result of my failure in the Gray mission. It would be easier if they just took me back. They would put me back in my little room, tucked away from the world. They would initiate Plan B, whatever that was. But if they didn't get me back and they knew that I was still out here, there was no doubt in my mind that they would do a clean sweep, a kill order. I knew too much to be left alive, even though in the scheme of things, I didn't know all that much. My tears were wearing out. The early tears left cold streaks on my face. I turned, trying to wipe them off on my shoulder, but I couldn't quite reach. Dan moved closer. No, really don't. He turned away, his eyes scanning the room for something, maybe a tissue. And when he couldn't find what he was looking for, he reached out his hand to wipe the tears away. I turned so that he couldn't touch me, but as I turned, I faced the door just in time to see Aaron enter with Brody behind him. They both froze, staring at us. Brody's mouth hung open like he was confused, but Aaron's face turned red as he stared at Dan, who was too stupid to put his outstretched arm down. Aaron took a step forward. He spit his words at Dan. "What do you think you're doing?" Dan put his hand behind his back, embarrassed. "Nothing." He smiled crookedly, a smile that probably worked on most people, especially women. Aaron moved right in front of him. "Why are you talking to her? I told you that wasn't your job." Dan shrugged and cast his eyes downward. I wouldn't be surprised if he kicked at an imaginary pebble. "I was trying to get information, and she's easy to talk to." "That's because she's tied up, you moron." Aaron turned to Brody. "I told you she was dangerous." He turned back to Dan. "Do not talk to her. She's going to try to manipulate you to get what she wants. That's what they do. That's what they're trained to do." I was surprised to hear Aaron say that, and thought that was what I was supposed to do. I wasn't very good at it, but I knew that there were other mimics who were. Dan's ears turned red. "Aaron, don't talk to me like I'm a child. I'm here, aren't I?" He straightened up, now standing about an inch taller than Aaron. "You aren't ready for this, Dan." Again, I was surprised, but this time I was surprised that Aaron would talk about Dan that way in front of me and paint him as the weak link. Maybe Aaron wasn't as smart as he seemed.